fellow speakers, ladies and gentlemen. I have to say, when I stand up and I get a mic in my hand, I begin to feel a bit like a rock star. It's always a strange feeling. It usually passes fairly quickly. But as I'm feeling like a rock star, rather than inflict my woeful singing voice upon you, perhaps I should begin with a quote from a rock star. That is Mick Jagger, from a particular song that was a hit for those of you old enough to remember. And I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about here tonight. We're out of touch, my baby, my poor discarded baby. Baby, 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 we're out of touch. And that's really what sums up our particular argument here tonight. NATO neutrality. Do you know what? I think you and I, agree more than we disagree. But what we're mixing up here is our perspectives and viewpoints about how we see the particular issues. Let's just buckle up now, because I've only a few minutes. I'd like to talk about it for longer, but Tom tells me I've only 7 minutes. And he was a former senior officer of mine, so I better be careful. But the issue here is, first of all, neutrality. Does anybody really believe that we're neutral? I certainly don't. And I say this not just as a bystander, but as somebody who has been a practitioner both in uniform and in work that I've done since within the EU and within the UN. Going back to the Second World War, if you look at our history, I commend you to read the odd book that has been written by Una Mahalpan, or even a more recent one called Irish Rebels and British Spies, which documents this country's role in the Second World War. Personally, I'm quite proud of it. But to think that we could claim to be an active neutral is nonsense. Neutrality, I hear you talk about active neutrality. I don't think there is such a thing. You're either engaged or you're not. You can't be a little bit pregnant and you can't be a little bit neutral. It's a nonsense. And we're all thinking people here tonight. When I hear the phrase that was used there in Minister Shatter's interview, Ireland, a militarily neutral country, you're either neutral or you're not. There's no ambiguity here. And quite frankly, we're not. Now, I could go on and stack that argument up further, and I'm happy to do so in questions that may take from the floor. But let's move on. What's the reason we're not in NATO? Is it because of some high-minded, noble, Irish ethical stance?
Yes.
No. Who said yes? Well, I commend you to check the history of this. Sean McBride, former Minister for External Affairs, was asked about joining NATO back, I think, in 1948. And the only reason that Ireland didn't want to join NATO back then was because it would reinforce partition. Because that's the only thing that we could see, that was the prism of partition was the only thing we could see our international relations evolving at the time. It was an erroneous step, in my opinion. And what did Mr. McBride do? He never really took this out and dusted it off in later life, but he's on record as having made an approach to the US about a bilateral defence treaty with the US, and the US turned us down. So the only reason we're not in any kind of a military alliance is by a mixture of happenstance and fate. So don't dress it up as anything else. See it as what it is. Everything I've said is documented. The reference to McBride is in declassified State Department records. You can Google them and you'll find them. So as I said, let's not get carried away here. We're no moral nor no worse than anybody else. It's a mixture of happenstance and internal politics that we're not in NATO. Now, let me move on. Let me fast forward. Personally, I'd have no issue with us joining up NATO. I'm a former soldier, I can see the benefits. On the other hand, I think that boat is said. I don't think we need to join NATO. We have the best of both worlds. And this is where I think our ideas actually coalesce somewhat. I think you are all in favour of the notion of this country having an independent foreign policy. And so am I. But not to be shackled. And I don't think we have an independent foreign policy. We're in a situation now that Bruno mentioned previously, he alluded to, about the triple lock mechanism. I can remember, I think I was still in the army, when it looked like the Chinese would veto a situation where our troops that were deployed under UN mandate to Macedonia, our troops and police, would have had to have been pulled out. Because of the Chinese. It didn't sit well with me, didn't sit well with my uniformed colleagues, but that's what we were facing. If we were actually a paid up member of NATO, we would have more say over where we sent our troops and what we were involved in, rather than our situation now with regards to UN missions, where any of the UN Security Council, with their veto, can affect how we deploy and where we deploy. I think that's a nonsense. We should be outraged about that. We should be able to make our own decisions about where we deploy and what we deploy. And we are doing that through the mechanism of the Partnership for Peace. Now, I heard Richard, I heard Joe, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard all about the evils of NATO. And I'm not going to try and dress it up and say that NATO is perfect. But nothing is perfect. Neither is the UN. I heard somebody say that Ireland never invaded a country. Actually, we did. We took part in the invasion of the newly independent Katanga back in 1961. Part of a UN force. Now, had history bounced, the ball of history bounced the other way, we might have been seen as aggressors. So I'm just saying things are never as clear-cut as they seem, but it's a messy business. Peacekeeping, conflict management is a messy business. And who better to know about that than the former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan? And what did Kofi Annan have to say about NATO? I remember I was doing a postgrad degree in peace studies, slightly ironic, back in the early part of the last decade. And I remember coming across a speech where, amongst other things, Kofi Annan decried the fact that there wasn't a NATO equivalent in Africa, because since the Brownlee Report and the creation of Chapter 7 missions, which are peace enforcement missions, which was always supposed to be the remit of the UN, but the Cold War stymied that. But the Chapter 7 missions are about having a force that has command and control and the ability to bang heads together. Now, without that command and control, without being able to partner up with organisations like NATO, the UN is limited. Its ability to effect peace is limited. I remember in the first of my 2 tours of duty as a civil military coordination officer to Darfur, and the civilian agencies who I was acting as a liaison with between them and the UN mission were decrying the fact that UNIMID had no teeth. The UN mission had no teeth. It was composed of countries that were badly trained, totally unsuited to peacekeeping, weren't properly armed, and were engaging in what could be described as provocative weakness because they were so unprofessional in how they deployed themselves. Not their fault. They were thrown together like a scratch team and expected to go out and play an All-Ireland winning game. And when the civilian agencies saw UFOR deploy across the border in Chad, they wanted to know, why can't we have that here? And Chad made a difference. It had a start, a middle, and an end. It didn't solve the whole problem, but it stabilised that region and contributed to the de-escalation of conflict. So in short, what I've got to say to you is this. Nothing is perfect. It's a messy, dirty world out there when it comes to conflict. And we either engage or we become irrelevant. Thanks for your patience.